What if Babylon's fall was humanity's rebirth? What if the dust that buried her towers did not mark an ending, but the beginning of everything we are? For thousands of years her name has echoed across deserts and scriptures alike. A city of gold and pride, of language and law, of gods who watched and men who reached too high. Yet behind the stories of sin and ruin lies something deeper, quieter, the pulse of a civilization that first taught us how to dream of eternity. When her walls fell, they did not take her spirit with them. They released it. From her ashes came the memory of law, the rhythm of writing, the whisper of stars that would guide every age after. Babylon did not vanish. She became the seed of every city that came to rise. Tonight we return to her, through time, through silence, through the breath of sand that still carries her name. Close your eyes and listen. You may hear the river. You may feel the echo of stone beneath your feet. Welcome to Cryptic Realm Channel, where the past never truly sleeps. If this journey stirs something within you, remember to subscribe, to share, to like, and to leave your thoughts below. Your voice keeps the ancient world alive. Now, let us begin. Before the ruins, before the fall, there was only the river. The Euphrates flowed like a living vein through the heart of the plain, patient and unbroken, long before the first walls of Babylon rose against the horizon. Its waters carried silt from forgotten mountains, shimmering beneath the sun that burned gold over Mesopotamia. Along its banks, people built their lives out of mud and reed, learning the rhythm of flood and drought, listening to the pulse of the earth until it began to speak back. In that slow communion between human hands and the fertile soil, something extraordinary began. Not an empire, not yet, but an idea. Civilization itself was being whispered into existence. They did not call it Babylon then. It was a cluster of huts near a curve of the river where traders stopped to rest their animals, where the air smelled of grain and smoke. The first scribes pressed symbols into wet clay to record the weight of barley, the number of sheep, the measure of silver. Those small wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, the first writing, were the earliest attempt to make memory permanent. It was as if humankind, sensing its own fragility, wanted to trap time within signs that could not die. The act of writing became a quiet rebellion against forgetting. As generations passed, the settlement grew. The mud bricks hardened into temples. A king rose whose name would echo through millennia: Hammurabi. He claimed the sun god Shamash had placed in his hands the laws that would bind the world to order. On a column of black diorite, he carved his code: eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But beneath its harshness lived the first understanding that even kings must answer to justice. The people gathered before the stele, reading what they could, memorizing what they could not. It was more than law. It was symmetry between heaven and earth. For the first time, the chaos of life was measured and written. And so Babylon was born, not from conquest, but from structure. From the human hunger to impose meaning on the endless. The city's foundations were laid on the belief that divinity could be reached through understanding. Temples rose like stairways, their terraces aligned to the constellations. Priests watched the skies from their ziggurats, charting the motions of Venus and Mars, believing that each light in the heavens was a god's eye looking down. When they drew those patterns in clay, astronomy was born, the science of the divine made visible. At night, the Euphrates became a mirror. The city's torches danced upon its dark surface, reflecting towers that had not yet been built but already existed in vision. The people looked into the water and saw eternity staring back. They believed their city was chosen, the gate of the gods, the meeting point between earth and heaven. Travelers spoke of it as a place where faith took form, where the human voice could reach the stars. The years unfolded like the river itself, slow and certain. Babylon became a crossroads for merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and dreamers. From the mountains came lapis lazuli, from distant forests, cedar wood, from deserts, gold. The markets shimmered with color, the air thick with spice, and the murmur of languages that blended like music. It was said that in Babylon every tongue could find its echo, that the city understood all speech. Perhaps that was why later legends would claim language itself had been divided there. But before the myth of Babel, there was only wonder. A city alive with voices, each one adding to the harmony of creation. The temples of Marduk glowed with firelight. The priests burned incense so thick that the air itself seemed holy. They spoke of a God not distant but present. Wisdom embodied, light made thought. His statue, carved in gold and lapis, watched over the city with eyes that caught the sun like living flame. Around him gathered the first mathematicians, the first architects, the first philosophers. Though they did not know those names, they were simply seekers. People who looked at the world and felt compelled to understand it. Yet even in its infancy, Babylon carried a shadow. Pride walked beside devotion, ambition beside reverence. The same hands that molded bricks for temples also built walls to separate themselves from others. The desire for permanence became a thirst for power. The river that had once given life began to serve as defense. The gates grew taller, the temples grander, the scribes prouder. Civilization was learning its first dangerous lesson. That to build heaven on earth is to risk becoming blind to the earth itself. Still the nights were filled with song. Women ground barley beneath the stars, their voices blending with the hum of crickets. Children floated small clay boats down the canals, laughing as the water carried them away. In the courtyards, lamps burned until dawn, and the wind carried the scent of myrrh and baked bread. Babylon was young, and in her youth she was radiant. The gods seemed close, the world endless, and the promise of eternity only a heartbeat away. But nothing built by mortal hands can remain untouched by time. Beneath the glow of the city's torches, the river whispered softly, as if warning of what it had seen before. The rise of Sumer, the fall of Akkad, the silence that follows greatness. Its current flowed on, patient, eternal, carrying with it both memory and prophecy. Did the people who walked those early streets know what they were beginning? Did they sense that their walls would outlast their names, that their prayers would echo across millennia? Or were they, like us, simply trying to hold back the night, to build something that might keep the darkness at bay, if only for a while? Morning rose over the plain like a breath drawn from the edge of creation. The sun spilled gold across the Euphrates, and in that light, Babylon began to take form. The sound of hammers rang through the air, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat made of stone. The people no longer built to survive. They built to endure. Each brick fired until it gleamed like amber was laid with a prayer. They said the walls of Babylon were wide enough for 2 chariots to race abreast, and so high that even the desert wind bowed before them. To build such walls was not merely to seek protection, it was to touch eternity with mortal hands. At the city's center rose the great ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was no ordinary tower. Its base was rooted in the dust of men, but its summit vanished into cloud. To climb it was to ascend from the human to the divine, from breath to silence. The priests said it joined the realms of gods and mortals, a stairway upon which the stars themselves could descend. The builders followed the rhythm of the heavens, measuring light and shadow, aligning each level with the paths of celestial fire. From its heights they watched the river curve like a silver serpent through the plain, and beyond it the endless sand that had once seemed infinite. Now Babylon was infinity made visible. The scent of baked clay filled the air. Men carried baskets of sand on their backs, their feet bleeding on the scaffolds. Women brought water in jars from the river, their songs weaving through the noise of labor. When they paused to rest, they looked up at the growing tower and saw their reflection in it, a monument to every dream they had ever dared to believe. The priests told them Marduk himself guided their work. In his temple, Esagila, they kept the sacred fires burning day and night, flames that symbolized divine thought taking form. The high priest whispered that the god's breath lived within every brick, that to build was to pray. And so they prayed with their hands. In time, Babylon became more than a city. It became a mirror of the cosmos. The ziggurat stood for the mountain of creation, the temples for the stars, the canals for the rivers of heaven. Even the walls were measured in sacred numbers, each gate aligned with a constellation. To walk through the city was to walk through a living calendar, a map of the universe turned into stone. At night, the torches flickered in the courtyards like constellations on earth. Travelers from distant lands said Babylon glowed as if the stars had descended to dwell among men. Within the walls, life unfolded with the steady rhythm of order. Merchants sold spices and fabrics brought from mountains and seas. Children learned to read the symbols pressed into clay. Farmers watched the rivers rise and fall, guided by charts that predicted the flood. The astronomers climbed the ziggurat at dusk, their eyes tracing the slow dance of planets. They believed that by understanding the heavens they could understand fate itself, and perhaps in their way they were right. For from their observations came the first calendars, the first reckonings of time, the first sense that life followed patterns written in the stars. But with understanding came ambition. The priests spoke of Marduk not merely as one god among many, but as the ruler of all. His image, cast in gold and lapis, was paraded through the city each new year in a procession of light. Trumpets echoed, drums thundered, and the people bowed as the statue passed, believing their god walked once more upon the earth. They said as long as Marduk smiled, Babylon would stand forever. And yet, the higher the city climbed, the more fragile its faith became. The songs of worship grew louder, but the silence between them grew longer. The temples gleamed brighter, but fewer hearts listened for the gods. Gold replaced humility, marble replaced clay, and the old prayers became ritual rather than conversation. The city in its perfection began to forget why it had been built. Pride, subtle and intoxicating, crept through its streets like incense too sweet to notice until it suffocates. Still, life went on. At dusk, the Euphrates shimmered beneath bridges carved with lions and bulls. Lovers walked its banks, whispering dreams into the wind. The scent of wine drifted through the markets, mingling with laughter and song. On festival nights, Babylon became a constellation of fire and music, a reflection of the heavens it had tried to capture. And in that beauty lived both grace and danger, for perfection is always the beginning of decay. Beyond the city's gates, the desert waited. The wind carried rumors from distant lands, of rising kings, of jealous gods, of empires watching from the horizon. But within the walls, the people felt untouchable. They had learned to harness the river, to measure the stars, to bind law into stone. They believed themselves chosen, eternal beyond the reach of time. The Euphrates flowed past, patient and knowing, murmuring softly to the reeds that bent along its edge. Did they hear it? That quiet warning in the voice of the river. The reminder that water gives and water takes. Did they ever pause amid their triumph to wonder how high a city can rise before the sky begins to notice? By the time Hammurabi's reign reached its height, Babylon was no longer a vision in clay, but a living pulse of empire. The air trembled with the rhythm of hammers striking bronze, of scribes etching words into wet tablets that would dry into memory. The scent of oil lamps and baked bread filled the streets, and in every corner one could hear the low hum of civilization perfecting itself. The code of Hammurabi stood at the city's heart, a black stele rising from the square like a pillar of thought made solid. Upon it the king had carved his will, line after line of order against chaos. To those who gathered beneath it, it seemed not just a decree, but a covenant between heaven and earth. They said the sun god Shamash had placed the laws into the king's hands, burning them into his mind like light upon stone. "I did not send my sword to crush the weak," Hammurabi declared, "but to prevent the strong from devouring them." Whether or not that was true no longer mattered, because it was written. In Babylon, what was written became eternal. Each symbol pressed into the black diorite was a promise that justice would outlast the breath of kings. The people believed that as long as those words endured, the city would never lose its soul. Yet even within the glow of righteousness, ambition flickered. The stele was placed where all could see it, but only the learned could read it. The scribes became gatekeepers of power, their hands shaping not only words, but destiny. They recorded every trade, every judgment, every offering to the gods. Clay after clay, line after line, they built a new kind of tower, one not of brick but of knowledge. In their tablets lived the first accountants, the first historians, the first poets who dared to capture the movement of thought itself. They were the quiet architects of eternity. Beneath the king's palace, the sound of chisel and mallet never ceased. Walls of polished limestone gleamed under torchlight, carved with scenes of battles and blessings. Hammurabi's throne stood upon a dais of cedar wood, its arms shaped like lions mid-roar. Around him the court glimmered with gold and lapis brought from distant lands. Captured gods from conquered cities stood in rows along the hall, their stone faces expressionless as they stared at the new ruler of their heaven. Babylon had become not only the heart of Mesopotamia, but its memory, absorbing, reshaping, and claiming all that lay within reach. Yet even a king who speaks with gods is not immune to silence. As the years passed, Hammurabi's dreams grew heavy. He would ascend the steps of Etemenanki at night, alone beneath the stars. The wind whispered through the tower's bricks like the voice of something ancient and indifferent. He would look down at the glowing city and feel a tremor of unease. "Let my name endure forever," he once prayed, "and may my works outlast the floods." The priest said Shamash heard him and wept. For to seek eternity is to call its shadow by name. After Hammurabi's death, the balance began to shift. His sons and their sons inherited the throne, but not his vision. The code remained, but its spirit dimmed. The laws that had once united the people became chains of bureaucracy, heavy and unfeeling. Justice turned to habit and habit to pride. The stele still stood in the square, its words gleaming faintly in the sun, but fewer eyes lifted to read them. Order endured, but meaning had begun to drift away like silt in the river. Still the city thrived. The markets swelled with traders, the temples with offerings. Festivals filled the streets with music and flame. From afar, Babylon looked immortal, its towers piercing the horizon like the ribs of a sleeping god. But within its splendor, a quiet fatigue began to bloom. The people obeyed the laws but no longer believed in them. The priests recited their hymns, but their voices lacked the tremor of faith. The gods had become administrators, the rituals routine. The divine once present in every brick had become a memory painted in gold. And yet, among the scribes in the royal library, there were some who still listened for the old heartbeat of the city. They copied the stories of floods and stars, of gods who built the world from chaos. They knew that time moved in circles, not lines, that every empire carried within it the seed of its own rebirth. When the river floods, one scribe wrote in the margin of a tablet, it does not destroy, it remembers its shape. Perhaps he understood what the kings did not, that permanence is an illusion, and every wall is only waiting to fall. As the centuries passed, new rulers came, each carving their name over the last. The city rose and crumbled and rose again, layer upon layer, a monument to persistence. Beneath every street lay another, beneath every temple another altar. Babylon became an archive of itself, the ground thick with centuries of dust and prayer. The Euphrates flowed on, carrying reflections of towers that no longer stood, whispering the same secret to every generation. That eternity does not belong to those who build, but to those who remember. Did Hammurabi's spirit linger among the ruins of his code, watching as his words turned from promise to echo? Did he see that what he had carved into stone was not law but longing? Humanity's attempt to make meaning stand still against the tide of time. And when he finally understood, did he smile, knowing that even in failure the dream had become immortal? When Nebuchadnezzar rose to power, Babylon had already endured the centuries like a patient flame. Dimmed, rekindled, dimmed again, but never extinguished. What he found was not a ruin, but a slumbering giant, its spirit buried beneath dust and memory. The river still curved around it like a protective arm, the old temples still breathed faint smoke from their altars, and in the silence between their cracked walls the name of Marduk still echoed. Nebuchadnezzar saw in this not decay but potential. He dreamed not merely of restoring Babylon, but of remaking it into the mirror of heaven itself. The king walked the city's foundations with the eye of an artist and the heart of a priest. He ordered the walls rebuilt, not in mud but in fire-glazed brick, each one stamped with his name as though he could press himself into the very bones of time. From sunrise to sunset, the city swelled with laborers, their chants blending with the rhythm of chisels and drums. The walls grew higher, the gates broader, the streets straighter. The desert wind carried the scent of burning pitch and fresh clay. And at night the horizon glowed faintly blue. Babylon was waking again. Then came the Gate of Ishtar, Nebuchadnezzar's masterpiece, a doorway not only into the city but into legend. Its bricks shimmered with lapis lazuli, deep as twilight, cool as the depths of the sea. Lions, bulls, and dragons marched across its surface in eternal procession, molded in gold and white. To stand before it was to feel small before divinity. Travelers approaching from the north would see it gleaming long before they reached its base, a threshold between the mortal and the divine. Beneath its arch began the processional way, a long avenue paved with limestone, where on holy days the gods themselves were carried in golden chariots while the people showered the road with petals. When the procession passed, the air filled with incense thick enough to make the sky shimmer. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and the people knelt as the statue of Marduk rolled through the gate, his golden face catching the firelight. They believed that in those moments heaven itself walked among them. Nebuchadnezzar, standing atop his palace balcony, would watch the procession with eyes that reflected both pride and reverence. "Let this be the wonder of all nations," he proclaimed, and so it was. Under his reign, Babylon became a mosaic of color and sound. The markets overflowed with spices from Arabia, ivory from India, and cedar from Lebanon. Scholars filled the libraries with tablets that recorded not only trade but dreams, observations of the stars, hymns to forgotten gods, letters of longing from soldiers stationed on the empire's borders. In the courtyards of the palace, fountains murmured beside marble benches where poets recited verses to the rhythm of water. It was said that even the wind changed its tone when it passed through Babylon, softening to match the harmony of the city. But Nebuchadnezzar's vision did not end with beauty. He wanted the city to endure beyond the reach of ruin, to make its perfection so complete that time itself would hesitate to touch it. He rebuilt the Ziggurat Etemenanki, layer upon layer higher than any before it. The summit disappeared into the haze, a staircase to the stars. From there the priests watched the heavens, marking the cycles of Jupiter and Venus, believing each orbit was a whisper from the divine. The temple bells rang at dawn and dusk, echoing across the plains like breaths of eternity. And yet the greater the glory, the heavier the silence beneath it. Within the palace walls, Nebuchadnezzar often walked alone. He was both creator and captive of his own grandeur. The city he had built no longer felt like his. It belonged to the gods, or perhaps to something older than them, to the hunger of humankind to defy impermanence. He would touch the cold blue tiles of the gate and feel beneath their smooth perfection the pulse of exhaustion. Greatness, he knew, demanded a price that even kings could not avoid. Outside the city, The Euphrates continued its endless journey, reflecting the golden glow of Babylon's torches upon its dark surface. At night it carried those reflections downstream, scattering fragments of light into the wilderness. Villagers miles away swore that the river itself glowed where it passed, as if Babylon's beauty had infected the water. But the river also whispered what no man wished to hear, that what shines too brightly must one day fade. Still within the walls, the illusion of eternity held. Dancers spun before the gate of Ishtar, their veils trailing sparks of firelight. Priests poured libations upon altars of alabaster. Children chased the shadows of lions that decorated the city's gates. The night air tasted of myrrh and victory. Babylon seemed untouchable, the jewel of the world, the dream of gods and men alike. But the desert remembers what the city forgets. Beyond the glow of torches where the stars burn clear and cold, something ancient was watching. The quiet law that governs all empires. Even now it waited in silence, as it always does, for the moment when ambition outgrows wisdom. Did Nebuchadnezzar, standing beneath the gate that bore his glory, ever sense the shadow gathering behind the light? Did he know that perfection, once reached, begins its slow descent toward dust? Or did he believe, as all dreamers do, that this time the gods would make an exception? If the walls of Babylon were its pride, then the hanging gardens were its soul. They rose from the heart of the city like a vision suspended between earth and heaven. A mountain made by human hands where water climbed instead of falling, and where the desert itself seemed to bloom. Nebuchadnezzar built them, they said, for his queen, a Midas of Media, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. She missed the scent of pine and cypress, the whisper of wind through valleys that Babylon's dry plains could never echo. So the king, who commanded armies and rivers alike, decided that even nature would bend to his love. He ordered his engineers to raise a terraced garden unlike anything the world had ever seen. They laid massive stone vaults, each strong enough to hold forests, and lined them with layers of lead and clay to trap the water within. Canals wound upward through the terraces, fed by hidden machinery that lifted the Euphrates skyward. Some said it was a chain of bronze buckets, others an endless spiral of wood that turned like the breath of the earth itself. Upon these terraces, soil was spread thick and dark, heavy with seeds brought from distant lands. Then came the miracle. Palms took root in the air, vines draped over marble railings, and flowers from mountains and islands bloomed in the desert sun. From afar, the garden shimmered like a mirage. Travelers approaching Babylon thought they saw a floating forest, its leaves glinting gold in the morning light, its shadows spilling across the palace roof. Within its shade, the queen would walk at dusk, her bare feet brushing the petals, her heart at ease in the scent of jasmine and fig. Some said the garden sang, that the wind moving through its layers made a music unlike any heard on earth, a harmony between stone and leaf, between love and power. Whether myth or memory, the garden captured the imagination of every age that followed. Greek historians wrote of it as one of the world's 7 wonders, though none could agree where it stood or if it ever truly existed. Archaeologists later found fragments, irrigation channels, massive arches, bricks glazed with green, but never the whole. Perhaps it was destroyed, perhaps it was a story, or perhaps both were true. For what is a city like Babylon if not the place where legend and reality are always the same thing said twice? To its people, the garden was more than a gift from king to queen. It was a symbol, proof that humanity could command creation, that beauty could be engineered from dust. The priests saw in it the reflection of their own cosmology. Heaven above, earth below, and life sustained by the flow of divine waters between. The garden was the cosmos made visible, the living diagram of existence. When the queen walked among its trees, they said she was not simply in a garden, but at the center of the universe. At night, lanterns hung from the branches like captured stars. The water from the terraces fell in silver threads, whispering through the leaves. Musicians played flutes and lyres in the shadows, and their notes mingled with the murmur of fountains. Servants moved silently, tending to the roots and channels that kept the paradise alive. Deep below, unseen, men worked endlessly to lift the water, their sweat feeding the miracle above. Every drop that touched a leaf had been carried by human endurance. A hidden labor beneath the beauty, like the pulse beneath the skin of a dream. It was said that Nebuchadnezzar would sometimes stand beside his queen, watching the gardens glow in the twilight. "Look," he would say, "even the gods could not grow such a place." And perhaps he believed it. The city around them glimmered with torches, its towers catching the last light of day. And from the highest terrace they could see the river like a mirror stretched to the horizon. In that moment the world must have seemed complete, a kingdom of water and flame suspended between faith and fulfillment. Yet perfection is a fragile thing. Beneath the garden's beauty, the foundations groaned, the weight of stone, soil, and water pressed down upon the arches. The air grew humid, heavy with life in a land meant for sand. The mechanism that fed the terraces never stopped. Its ceaseless rhythm echoed like a heartbeat through the night. Perhaps that is why some said the garden was alive, not merely with plants, but with the longing that created it. Over the centuries, the garden faded into silence. The vines withered, the water ran dry, the terraces crumbled. Time does not preserve miracles, it transforms them. And yet the idea of the hanging gardens never died. It became the memory of what humanity could do when love and power shared the same dream. Even today, when archaeologists unearth the ruins of Babylon, they still search for its ghost. A hint of green in the dust, a trace of water where none should flow. Did the queen, standing upon the highest terrace, ever look toward the distant hills of Media and feel at home? Or did she, in the quiet of her paradise, realize that beauty built from longing can never still the heart that yearns? And when the last leaf fell into the empty pool, did anyone hear it? Or had Babylon already begun to forget how to listen? There are nights that belong to no age, moments that drift between dream and memory. Babylon had many such nights, but none more haunting than those that came when Nebuchadnezzar began to walk alone through his palaces. The torches still burned in their bronze sconces. The fountains still sang in the courtyards. The musicians still played beneath the carved lions of his throne room. Yet the king's steps echoed through the corridors as if through an empty world. He had built everything that could be built. His towers pierced the sky. His gardens touched the clouds. His gates gleamed brighter than sunrise. and still something within him remained unfinished. They said the king no longer slept. He would rise before dawn and climb the terraces of his palace, standing in the half-light while the city dreamed below. The Euphrates shimmered in the darkness, its slow current reflecting the broken glimmer of torches. From above, the water looked like molten bronze, carrying the city's light downstream into eternity. Nebuchadnezzar would stare at his reflection in that restless river. The image of a man who had conquered everything except his own heart. In the early years of his reign, he had spoken often to the priests, asking about omens, about the will of Marduk, about the fate of kings who challenged the divine. But as his city grew, he grew silent. The gods no longer answered him as they once had. Their voices seemed faint, hidden behind the hum of machinery, the endless clatter of wealth and worship. He looked upon the golden statues in the temples and saw only himself. The same fixed stare, the same cold perfection. Somewhere between devotion and achievement, the boundary had blurred. The scribes wrote that his eyes grew darker, as though shadowed by dreams too heavy to carry. He began to see signs in everything: the flight of a bird, the curl of smoke, the trembling of light on the river. He would summon the astrologers at night, demanding that they read the sky for hidden messages. When they hesitated, he turned away and muttered, "Even the stars are silent now." One evening he called for the royal scribes and commanded them to read aloud every record of his reign. Every temple built, every law enacted, every enemy defeated. Their voices filled the hall like the echo of a storm trapped in stone. When they finished, he sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the flicker of the lamps. "And what," he asked softly, "will be written when I am gone?" No one dared to answer. The silence stretched long and heavy. Then the king rose and said, "Write this, that I built a city that outshone the gods, and in doing so forgot why we build at all." After that night he began to wander the city in disguise. Dressed as a merchant or a soldier, he walked the streets without his crown, listening. In the markets he heard laughter, bargaining, gossip, and prayer. The pulse of life that did not need kings to survive. He saw children shaping tiny bricks of clay, building walls for their toys and knocking them down again. A mother laughed and said, "Do not build too high, my son, or it will fall." Nebuchadnezzar smiled faintly, but those words stayed with him. Later in his chamber he wrote them on a tablet. "All towers fall by the weight of their own reaching." Still, he could not escape the unease that crept through his dreams. One night he saw a great tree growing in the center of the earth. Its crown reached the heavens, its roots drank from the sea, and its branches sheltered every living thing. Then a voice thundered from the clouds, "Cut it down. Leave only the stump bound with iron and bronze." When he awoke, his heart was pounding. He summoned his seers, but none dared to tell him what it meant. The priests whispered that the dream was a warning, that pride was a crown made of thorns. Nebuchadnezzar dismissed them, yet he could not shake the feeling that the voice had spoken to him alone. In the seasons that followed, the king withdrew from the world. He spent long hours in the garden, sitting beside dry fountains, watching the leaves fall into still water. Amytis, the queen, found him there one morning. "The water has stopped," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She knelt beside him and answered, "Perhaps it waits for rain." He looked at her, and for a moment his eyes softened. Then let it rain, he said, and let the earth remember me kindly. When the rains finally came, they came with fury. The sky split open, the clouds unleashed their weight, and the streets of Babylon became rivers of mud and reflection. From the palace balcony, the king lifted his hands to the storm. If the gods would speak, he cried, let them speak through thunder. But the thunder said nothing. It only rolled away, vast and indifferent. That night, the Euphrates overflowed. The water surged through the canals and gardens, seeping into the foundations of the palaces. The slaves worked through the darkness, piling sandbags and reciting prayers, but the flood could not be stopped. By dawn, the water receded, leaving behind silt and silence. Nebuchadnezzar stood barefoot in the courtyard, the hem of his robe soaked, his reflection broken in puddles. The river, he murmured, has taken back what was always its own. Perhaps in that moment he understood the truth that every empire forgets, that the earth borrows what it lends and time collects its debts without anger. Did he realize then that the dream of Babylon could never last forever? Did he know that the tree in his vision had been his own creation? Magnificent, sheltering, inevitable in its fall? Or did he even then still hope that by remembering the river's voice, he could make it sing again? Long before the sound of empire faded, the stars continued their quiet watch. They had seen kings rise and fall, had watched walls bloom and crumble, and still they kept their patient rhythm, indifferent to the noise below. In Babylon it was said that the stars were the eyes of the gods, and to look upon them was to read the mind of eternity. Upon the ziggurat, where the air thinned into silence, the astronomer priests gathered each night to listen to that celestial language, a code written not in words but in light. Their temple atop Etemenanke was no ordinary sanctuary. It was both altar and observatory, a bridge between the human and the divine. The stairways spiraled upward like a serpent of stone, and at its summit stood an open platform, bare except for an altar of bronze and a single tablet of clay. From there one could see the world unfurl in every direction. The winding Euphrates to the west, the flat shimmer of desert to the east, and the sprawl of Babylon glowing with 1,000 lamps below. To the priests that sight was more than beauty. It was order, proof that the cosmos was mirrored in the design of their city. As above, so below, they whispered, believing that the heavens and the earth were two sides of the same thought. Each night they traced the paths of the planets, marking the wanderers, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and giving them the names of gods. They measured the eclipses, the conjunctions, the return of Venus after its long absence, and from these patterns they built the first calendars. The stars were no longer chaos, they were law, and law was the breath of creation. To the priests, to measure the sky was to honor Marduk himself, the god who had tamed the primordial waters. Their knowledge was sacred and secret. They pressed their discoveries into clay tablets and stored them in the temple's library, where scribes copied them by lamplight. The room smelled of wax and dust, of time itself being turned into permanence. Thousands of tablets filled the shelves, records of eclipses, predictions of rain, tables of planetary motion. Long before any man spoke of science, Babylon had already begun to understand that the divine could be studied. The astronomers did not think of themselves as challengers of the gods. They believed they were learning their grammar. Yet the deeper they looked into the heavens, the quieter their gods became. The priests began to realize that the stars followed patterns that never changed, cycles that no prayer could alter. The constellations rose and fell, not in obedience to will, but to law. What did it mean if fate itself could be predicted? Was prophecy still divine if it could be calculated? These were questions they did not speak aloud, for to question the gods was to risk being noticed by them. One apprentice, young and reckless, once asked his teacher as they watched the sky, "If the gods write their will in the stars, who writes the will of the gods?" The elder struck him not out of anger but fear. "Do not ask what has no answer," he whispered. But that question lingered, echoing in the boy's mind as the constellations wheeled above them. It would echo still centuries later, when other men gazed at the same sky and called their pursuit astronomy, not faith. When dawn came, the priests descended the ziggurat with weary eyes, their robes heavy with dew. They delivered their readings to the scribes who carried them to the palace. The king would listen, nodding as they spoke of omens and alignments, of storms and seasons, of peace or war. Sometimes the predictions came true, sometimes they did not. Yet each failure only deepened the priests' devotion, for to them mystery was not proof of ignorance but of the gods' mercy. That humanity was allowed to look upon the infinite and not go mad. Below, the city pulsed in rhythm with the heavens. Farmers sowed their fields according to the positions of the moon. Merchants planned their voyages by the movement of Venus. Even the festivals of Marduk followed celestial signs. The people did not see themselves as ruled by the stars, but guided by them, threads in a vast tapestry woven across sky and soil. The Euphrates reflected that tapestry each night, its dark waters shimmering with the constellations, a mirror of the Milky Way above. "The river is the sky," the priest said, "and the sky is the river." But even among the devoted, whispers began to stir. Some said the stars did not speak of gods at all, that they were fire, distant and cold. Others believed the gods had left the heavens entirely, leaving only their patterns behind. The priests silenced such thoughts quickly, yet the unease remained. Knowledge once opened cannot be closed again. On the final night of the year, when the city's fires burned brightest and the processional way filled with music, the chief astronomer climbed the ziggurat alone. He looked up and saw the familiar constellations blazing like a script he could no longer read. The sky was clear, the air still. "Tell me," he whispered to the emptiness, "if the gods still watch, what do they see in us?" The wind offered no answer, only the faint hiss of sand against stone. Perhaps that was when he understood what no king or priest wished to admit, that the stars do not speak of cities or empires, but of cycles. That even the brightest constellations fade, only to return in another season, in another form. The heavens remember, but they do not mourn. Did he feel comfort in that truth, or despair? Did he, looking into the infinite, recognize himself? A brief flicker of light destined to vanish, yet still part of the pattern that never ends? The night of the feast began as a celebration of immortality. The torches along the processional way burned with oil thick as honey, casting their glow upon dancers whose shadows leapt across the walls. The air was sweet with incense and wine, heavy with laughter. In the courtyards, musicians plucked lyres of silver and flutes carved from cedar, weaving songs that shimmered above the roar of the crowd. Babylon was alive with light, golden, reckless, and oblivious to the silence gathering beyond its gates. The city had survived droughts and floods, wars and prophecy. To its people, that endurance felt like proof that the gods themselves could not undo what human hands had built. Inside the palace of Belshazzar, son of Nebuchadnezzar, the feast reached its height. Columns of lapis and gold reflected the flicker of firelight, and the walls were hung with tapestries showing the king's triumphs. Tables bowed beneath the weight of roasted lamb, figs, honey, and dates dripping with syrup. Servants poured wine into goblets of silver until the floors gleamed red with spilled drops. The laughter of nobles rang out like cymbals, loud and defiant, as though joy could drown out the whisper of unease that haunted the edges of the night. Outside, the wind shifted. The torches sputtered. Far beyond the river, the army of Cyrus the Great was on the move. But within the palace, no one spoke of war. Belshazzar raised his cup high and shouted, "Let Babylon rejoice! Let the gods see that we fear nothing!" The crowd cheered, drunk on their own confidence. The walls that surrounded them, walls so wide that chariots could race upon them, seemed eternal. Behind those walls, no army could reach them, or so they believed. As the night deepened, the king called for the sacred vessels of gold and silver, the ones his father had taken from the Temple of Jerusalem decades before. The priests hesitated, for these cups were consecrated to another god, a god of exiles and whispers. But Belshazzar laughed. "If the heavens will not descend to join us," he said, "then let us rise to meet them." The vessels were brought, gleaming beneath the torchlight. Wine poured like blood into their hollow mouths. The nobles toasted to Babylon, to Marduk, to Belshazzar himself, and drank from what should never have touched mortal lips. The laughter died first. A strange hush fell over the hall. The air thickened, the torches dimmed, and then upon the plaster wall beside the king's throne, a faint glow appeared, the outline of a hand moving as if it belonged to light itself. The fingers wrote swiftly, carving fire into shadow. No sound accompanied it, only the slow unraveling of certainty. The hand wrote 4 words, and then it was gone, leaving behind letters that pulsed with their own pale flame. Mene mene tekel uparsin. The music stopped. The king's face drained of color, his hands trembled. "Bring the magi," he cried. "Bring the priests, the astrologers, and anyone who can read this." They came running, robes fluttering, eyes wide with terror. But none could interpret the message. Their silence filled the hall until even the sound of breathing felt loud. The writing glowed brighter, as though mocking their ignorance. At last, an old man was brought forward, a captive from the west, a prophet named Daniel. His eyes were calm, his voice steady. "This is the word of the Most High," he said. "Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed and found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." Belshazzar stared at the words, unable to look away. For a heartbeat, the hall seemed to tilt. The torches guttered, and the laughter that had once filled the night returned only as an echo, hollow and cold. The king forced a smile, though his lips quivered. "Reward him," he said, his voice cracking. Clothe him in scarlet, place gold upon his neck, he shall be honored among men. But the prophet only bowed, and in his silence was pity, not pride. Outside the walls the river whispered. The Euphrates, which had guarded Babylon for centuries, was changing its course. Cyrus's engineers had diverted its waters into canals, lowering its level until soldiers could pass beneath the gates through the dry riverbed. The city that believed itself eternal had left open its only vein. Before dawn, the Persians entered. They came not with thunder, but with the soft tread of inevitability. The guards at the gates were drunk. The watchfires had burned low. By the time the first light touched the horizon, it was over. The palace was silent, the feast extinguished, and the walls that had once glowed with divine fire now echoed with the quiet of conquest. When morning came, the people awoke to find new banners above their temples. The winged emblem of Ahura Mazda fluttering where the lion of Ishtar once stood. The conqueror had not razed the city, he had simply replaced its gods. The spirit of Babylon did not fall in battle. It was undone by its own blindness, by the illusion that eternity can belong to men. The river flowed on, indifferent, carrying reflections of broken torches down to the sea. Did the hand on the wall write only to Belshazzar, or to every empire that believes its glory will never fade? Did it not say in words of fire that all kingdoms are weighed the same, and that even the brightest feast must end in silence? When the dust of conquest settled, Babylon lay strangely untouched, its walls unbroken, its temples still standing, its gates still gleaming beneath the pale morning sun. The Persians had entered not as destroyers, but as something colder. Inevitability wearing the face of mercy. The city had not fallen with a roar, but with a sigh. The streets were silent except for the measured steps of soldiers whose armor caught the light like shards of order imposed upon chaos. For the first time in 1,000 years, the lion of Ishtar no longer ruled the wind. Cyrus the Great entered through the northern gate at dusk. His procession was quiet, almost reverent. The people watched from doorways, their fear tempered by curiosity. He came not shouting conquest, but speaking restoration. His proclamation was read in every square, carried on papyrus and word of mouth. All peoples held captive by Babylon may return to their homelands. Their gods shall be restored, their temples rebuilt. It was a decree unlike any the city had heard, an act of liberation that was also a quiet dismantling of Babylon's soul. To those once enslaved by the empire, Cyrus was salvation. The exiled Jews, long mournful by the rivers of Babylon, lifted songs of gratitude to their unseen God. They saw in the Persian king not a conqueror but an instrument of divine will. Their captors became their deliverer, and in that reversal lay one of history's gentlest cruelties. For the Babylonians themselves, mercy felt like exile. They had ruled the world. Now they were subjects within another man's vision. Their gods, once carried through the streets in golden chariots, now stood beside the altars of strangers. The priests of Marduk gathered in the great temple of Esagila, their chants faltering beneath the high ceiling. The sacred fires still burned, but the air around them had changed. Cyrus, in a gesture of respect, ordered Marduk's statue carried through the streets once more. Yet even this act of honor felt hollow, as though the god's procession was no longer a triumph, but a remembrance. The priests performed the old rituals, but their voices trembled, uncertain whether the heavens still listened. A god once hailed as king of all creation now bowed in silence before the empire of men. In the marketplace, life resumed with cautious rhythm. The Persians, unlike the conquerors before them, did not plunder. They bought grain, inspected warehouses, and spoke in soft tones of taxes and peace. Babylon's merchants found themselves trading not under tyranny, but under law. A law written in another tongue, spoken by men who worshipped a god without image, without temple, a god whose voice was said to dwell in fire and light. To the Babylonians, that idea was both fascinating and terrible. A god unseen could not be contained, not even by walls of gold. At night, the city still glowed, but the light had changed. The torches burned lower. The music of festivals grew rare. The air that once pulsed with celebration now felt heavy with thought. The people still spoke the name of Marduk, but in whispers, as if afraid that the new god of the Persians might overhear. In their silence grew a kind of melancholy wisdom, the slow realization that glory is not stolen by force but surrendered by forgetting. Cyrus governed with patience. He repaired the canals, reopened the trade routes, and allowed the temples to remain. To the world beyond, it seemed Babylon had been spared. But inside its heart, a different kind of erosion began. The city no longer believed in its own eternity. The priests performed the ceremonies out of habit. The people attended them out of nostalgia. The rituals that had once bound heaven and earth together now felt like gestures to keep memory from fading. Years passed. Cyrus fell, and Darius the Great ruled in his place. He fortified the empire, built roads that spanned continents, connected mountains to seas. Couriers carried messages from Persepolis to Babylon in days. The world had grown vast, but Babylon had grown small. It was no longer the axis of creation, only a brilliant chamber in a palace of many nations. The Persians admired its beauty, but it was the admiration one gives a relic, precious, yet past its use. In the temples, resentment simmered. The priests longed for the old days, for the sound of trumpets and the heat of festivals that once made the city feel alive. They whispered of rebellion, of restoring Marduk to his throne, when Darius raised new taxes and stationed foreign governors within the city. Those whispers turned to sparks. Twice Babylon rose against its masters, and twice it was crushed. The Persian armies, though patient, were not infinite in mercy. The gates that had once welcomed gods now watched their own sons hanged upon them. After the second rebellion, Darius stripped the city of its privileges. The statue of Marduk was taken away, the sacred ceremonies suspended. The festival of the new year, where the people once wept with joy as the god's image passed through the gate of Ishtar, was never held again. The silence that followed was deeper than conquest. It was as if the city had exhaled its final breath. Still the Euphrates flowed on, untroubled, its current whispering through the reeds. It had seen Akkad, Sumer, and it had seen them vanish. Now it watched Babylon's flame dim under Persian rule, the river reflecting less and less of its golden walls with each passing year. The water did not mourn. It carried memory like silt, heavy but patient, waiting for the next seed of empire to take root. And yet in the quiet corners of the city, the old hymns still survived. Mothers sang them to their children at night, not as prayers but as lullabies. The priests, though forbidden, still climbed the ziggurat at dawn, tracing the stars with trembling fingers. They whispered, "The flame of Marduk is not gone. It has only hidden." Perhaps that was true. For empires may rule the body, but faith belongs to the places even kings cannot see. Did the Persians ever wonder, as they stood upon the terraces of the palace, what it means to inherit another civilization's ghosts? Did they feel the weight of that silence? The silence that follows not defeat, but the loss of belief itself? And if Babylon could be tamed, what empire could ever believe itself safe from the same fate? By the time the Persians had grown old in their dominion, Babylon had begun to fade from brilliance into something softer, something almost human. The walls still towered above the plain. The gates still gleamed faintly under the sun, but their perfection had dulled. Dust clung to the carvings of lions, ivy crept along the edges of the blue-glazed tiles. The voices that once echoed through its streets were quieter now, replaced by the murmur of merchants and the cooing of doves that nested in the eaves of abandoned temples. Babylon no longer roared, it breathed. The Persians treated the city as a jewel in their crown, a place to be admired but not understood. Governors came and went. Foreign tongues filled the markets, and the rituals that once defined the rhythm of Babylonian life became curiosities to outsiders. The great ziggurat at Temenanki still cast its shadow across the city, but few climbed its steps anymore. The topmost platform, where priests once measured the heartbeat of the stars, was silent save for the wind. The temple bells no longer called to Marduk. Their cords had long since frayed, and yet beneath the stillness, something persisted. The people of Babylon, though ruled by others, refused to forget. They kept their faith not in grandeur but in small gestures, the way a lamp was lit at dusk, the way water was poured into the soil before planting, the way a mother whispered ancient prayers over her sleeping child. These were the embers of memory glowing quietly in the ashes of empire. Travelers still came from distant lands, drawn by the stories of the city that once ruled the world. They walked the processional way, tracing the faded reliefs of dragons and bulls with their fingertips. They marveled at the scale of the walls, the artistry of the gates, and wondered how such things could have been built without divine help. The local guides, descendants of scribes and priests, told them tales of Nebuchadnezzar, of Hammurabi, of the gardens that had once hung like clouds. They spoke of a city so perfect that the gods grew jealous and withdrew their favor. The travelers listened with awe, never realizing that even as they did, Babylon's story was changing again. From history into myth. At night, the desert wind moved through the empty courtyards, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and the whisper of forgotten prayers. Some said the city was haunted, that the spirits of its kings still walked the ramparts, staring out across the plain for armies that would never return. Persian soldiers stationed there refused to enter the temple district after sunset. They spoke of lights flickering among the ruins, of music drifting faintly through the air, though no instruments played. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps it was the city remembering itself. Among the last of Babylon's true scribes was a man named Nabu-Reshu, born long after the fall of Nebuchadnezzar. He worked by the dim light of an oil lamp in a small chamber beneath what had once been the library of Marduk. His hands were thin, his eyes weak, but his touch was precise. Each night he pressed his stylus into soft clay, copying hymns and chronicles before they vanished from living memory. "To forget," he once wrote, "is the second death." His words were not prophecy, but devotion, an act of defiance against silence. Sometimes Persian officials would come to inspect the archives, curious about the city's past. They would watch the old scribe at work, his fingers steady as he traced the signs of a language they could not read. "Why do you persist?" one of them asked. "The world speaks a new tongue now." Nabureshu smiled without looking up. "Because one day," he said, "you will not." Outside, the Euphrates flowed more sluggishly than before. Its course had begun to shift, slowly abandoning the channels that once fed the city's lifeblood. The docks, once crowded with boats heavy with grain and cedar, now stood half dry, their moorings tangled with reeds. Fishermen complained that the river no longer sang the same. Perhaps it was only the current changing. Or perhaps the river, too, was forgetting. In the evenings, the people gathered near the Ishtar gate, lighting small fires and telling stories of what had been. Children listened wide-eyed as elders spoke of gardens that touched the sky, of a hand that once wrote upon a wall, of kings who dreamed of eternity. For the young, these were legends. For the old, they were memory disguised as myth. Yet in the telling, something survived, the rhythm of belief that had always been Babylon's true heartbeat. The Persians, for all their might, could not extinguish that. They could govern the land, command the trade, enforce their laws, but they could not own the past. The Babylonians understood that history was not a thing that could be conquered. It was a river, sometimes diverted, never stopped. And so, even as the city's splendor faded, it became something rarer. It became a bridge between what had been and what was yet to come. The people who walked its streets were no longer subjects of empire, but custodians of memory. The clay beneath their feet held the imprints of thousands of years, each layer a record of belief, ambition, and fall. At night, when the stars appeared over the dark outline of the ziggurat, the city seemed to breathe again. The wind moved softly through the reeds, and the faint shimmer of torchlight glowed against the old bricks. Those who listened carefully could hear it, the low hum of the past still alive, still speaking through the cracks of time. Did the Persians ever hear that sound, faint and steady as a heartbeat beneath the silence of empire? Did they know that while they ruled its surface, Babylon's spirit remained untouched below, waiting, patient, and eternal as the river itself? By the time the Persians' banners began to fade under sun and wind, Babylon had learned the art of survival through stillness. The city no longer needed to conquer or proclaim. It simply endured. The once blazing tiles of the Ishtar gate had paled to the color of dusk, and the walls, though scarred, still stood, not as fortresses but as witnesses. Travelers arriving from the west saw their reflection in those vast bricks and whispered that Babylon had outlived every nation that once sought to own her. Yet within, the city had grown quiet in its grandeur, content to be a memory rather than a power. The Persians had long since moved their capitals elsewhere. The court of Darius now shone in Persepolis, and Babylon was reduced to a provincial jewel, rich, venerable, and fading. The governors ruled from palaces built atop the ruins of older ones, unaware that beneath their feet lay the bones of empires stacked like sedimentary dreams. They walked on history without feeling its weight, but the earth felt it. The ground of Babylon was thick with remembrance, every grain of dust holding fragments of clay tablets, broken statues, crushed amulets, pieces of language, belief, and pride mixed into one continuous breath of time. Travelers still came. Greeks, Lydians, traders from Egypt and the Levant, seeking the echo of the world's first city of wonder. They brought gifts for the temples that remained open, offerings of oil and incense for gods whose names they no longer pronounced correctly. The priests, aged and few, accepted them in silence, their chants softer than wind. Their eyes no longer lifted toward the heavens. They had learned to pray inwardly, to the memory of what once was. For them, Babylon had become a temple itself, its streets the corridors of worship, its silence the final hymn. At night, the Euphrates moved like a slow mirror through the shadow of the city. Its banks had widened, eating away at old embankments, erasing the edge between land and water. Fishermen still cast their nets by torchlight, and sometimes they hauled up strange shapes from the mud. Fragments of idols, glazed shards of tile, bits of carved stone. They would lay them beside the fire, studying the symbols faintly etched upon their surfaces. The gods, they said, still rise from the river. But in truth it was memory that refused to drown. The Persians had allowed Babylon to keep its scholars, and so its libraries survived even when its kings did not. Within them, scribes continued their work, translating old records into newer tongues, preserving treaties and prayers, and copying the wisdom of centuries. Some among them began to write differently, less for ritual, more for thought. They recorded the cycles of the stars, the mathematics of building, the geometry of the heavens. Babylon's science had outlasted its gods. What had begun as devotion had become observation. And so, unknowingly, the city that once worshipped the stars became the mother of reason. Still, reason could not replace wonder. The people of Babylon lived between two worlds, the divine and the ordinary, the remembered and the real. They could not abandon the stories that had shaped them. On festival nights, when the moon hung low and red over the horizon, the elders told tales of Marduk slaying the dragon of chaos, of the tower that reached the sky, of a flood that washed the world clean. The children listened, their faces lit by the glow of oil lamps. In their eyes, the gods lived again, not as rulers, but as memories turned into light. The Persians did not forbid such stories. They considered them harmless, relics of an older truth. But the Babylonians knew that words have endurance beyond walls. Every story told was another act of defiance, a quiet assurance that even forgotten gods never entirely die. One winter, a Persian official ordered the dismantling of an abandoned temple to reuse its bricks for a granary. When the workers pried apart the ancient stones, they found beneath the altar a small sealed jar. Inside were tablets inscribed in the old language, prayers to Marduk and Ishtar written by hands long turned to dust. The foreman brought them to the official, who could not read them, and so he gave them to a local scribe for translation. The scribe, gray-haired and patient, spent the night decoding the symbols by the flicker of lamplight. The words read, "If ever this house should fall, let these words rebuild it in the hearts of those who remember." The scribe said nothing. He buried the jar again beneath the new foundation. Outside the city, the desert stretched endlessly, swallowing the traces of forgotten roads. Yet within the walls, the air still carried the scent of myrrh and smoke, as if the past lingered just beyond the veil of the present. The wind that once howled now hummed softly through the cracks of stone, sounding almost like breath. Babylon had become a ghost that refused to die, not haunting the world but dreaming it. At twilight, when the first stars appeared above the river, the people lit their lamps and placed them along window sills and courtyards. The tiny flames flickered like constellations scattered across the city, as though the heavens had come down to rest upon the earth once more. From afar, travelers would mistake it for a living Babylon, vibrant as legend, unaware that what they saw was memory disguised as light. Did the people who lit those lamps know they were keeping vigil for their own history? Did they understand that every flame was a prayer not for the gods, but for remembrance itself, a way to whisper into eternity? We were here. We built. We dreamed. We are not yet gone. By the time Alexander came from the west, Babylon had already grown weary of kings. The Persians, though still powerful, were fading at the edges, their empire stretched thin across mountains and deserts that refused to obey. The city had watched rulers come and go for centuries, their names carved into stone and swallowed by dust. It no longer trembled at the arrival of conquerors. But when the Macedonian army crossed the Euphrates, even the river seemed to pause. For the first time in living memory, Babylon greeted a stranger who spoke not in conquest, but in awe. Alexander entered the city as if returning to a dream. He had heard of Babylon since childhood, the city of stars, the heart of empires, the place where gods once walked among men. When the gates opened before him, the soldiers expected fire and blood. Yet what greeted them was music. The people lined the streets, offering flowers and palm leaves, not resistance. They had grown tired of defiance. Surrender felt almost like peace. Alexander walked beneath the blue arch of the Ishtar gate and whispered, "So this is where the world began." He was only 25. The torchlight caught the bronze of his armor and reflected it upon the walls that had seen Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, and Cyrus pass before him. He ordered that the temples be restored and the old rituals revived. The priests, cautious at first, soon returned to their sanctuaries. The statue of Marduk, long neglected, was cleaned and oiled until its golden face gleamed once more. When Alexander stood before it, he bowed, a gesture that startled even his generals. "Let the great god of Babylon bless my reign," he said, and for a moment the city breathed again. Not as prisoner, but as participant in its own revival. He spent days wandering the ruins of the Ziggurat et Temenanki, running his hand along the weathered bricks, listening to the wind that sighed through its broken tiers. "Rebuild it," he ordered, "and let it reach the sky once more." The work began with feverish devotion. Laborers cleared the rubble, engineers measured the foundations, and priests sang the ancient songs of blessing that had not been heard in generations. The sound of chisels and hammers filled the air, mingling with the laughter of foreign soldiers who marveled at the city's splendor. Babylon seemed to wake from its long sleep as though recognizing itself in the eyes of this young conqueror who wanted not to destroy but to understand. In the evenings, Alexander would stand on his palace balcony and watch the sun set over the Euphrates. The river burned red beneath the light, flowing like molten gold toward the horizon. He saw in it the reflection of every empire that had risen and fallen along its banks. "This," he said to his companion Hephaestion, "is the heart of the world. Whoever holds Babylon holds eternity." The words were both prophecy and curse. For though Alexander was a conqueror of nations, he was also a dreamer, one who sought not kingdoms but continuity. He envisioned Babylon as the center of a new world, where East and West would merge, where gods of many lands could share the same altar. He ordered scholars to collect the knowledge of Persia, Egypt, and Greece to translate them into a single universal tongue. He planned roads that would bind the corners of the earth to this city by the river, this place where creation and ambition had always met. "Let there be one world," he said, "and one light to guide it." But the gods, if they listened, were silent. The ziggurat rose slowly, tier by tier, until it stood halfway to the clouds when the work suddenly stopped. Fever swept through the workers' camp. The rains failed, and the river dropped lower than it had in a generation. The air turned heavy and strange. Even the sky seemed dimmer, as if the stars themselves were watching with wary patience. It was in that air that Alexander fell ill. At first it was dismissed as exhaustion, the price of endless campaigns, but the sickness deepened. The doctors could do nothing. For 12 days he lay in his chamber within the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, his body burning, his voice fading. The empire waited outside his door. His generals whispered of omens and betrayal. When the end came, it came quietly, like the closing of a gate. They said that in his final moments Alexander asked to be carried to the window, to see the river once more. He stared at the dark water glinting under the moon, and for a heartbeat he smiled. "I smell rain," he whispered, though the sky was clear. Then he was gone. The work on the ziggurat ceased. The tools were left where they fell. The city held its breath, suspended between grief and disbelief. The young conqueror who had promised eternity had died in the house of those who once built it. The wheel had turned once more, perfectly, inevitably. In the months that followed, his empire shattered like clay dropped from trembling hands. The generals divided the lands among themselves, each claiming a piece of what he had dreamed whole. Babylon became a prize among them, fought over, forgotten, and fought for again. When the fires burned out, and the last of the soldiers marched away, only the wind remained whispering through the broken stones. The ziggurat stood unfinished, its summit open to the stars. It had reached as high as human hands could carry it before the heavens reminded them, again, how small they were. Did the gods mourn the man who had tried to unite what they had divided? Did Babylon for a moment believe that through him it might live forever? Or did the city, wiser than all its kings, already know that every dream of unity must one day break upon the same eternal river? After Alexander's death, the silence that settled over Babylon was unlike any before it. The streets that had once thrummed with soldiers and scholars were suddenly hollow. filled only with the echo of tools abandoned mid-strike. The ziggurat, half reborn, half ruined, stood like a broken promise against the sky. The Macedonian banners drooped in the heat, their colors fading to dust. No one knew who ruled anymore, only that the dream had died in its cradle. In the first months, the city mourned quietly. The priests reopened the temples, but their chants felt mechanical, their incense perfunctory. The people went about their lives as though moving through the shadow of something vast and unfinished. The Persians had ruled through order, the Greeks through vision, but neither had managed to give Babylon what it craved most on meaning. Without it, even beauty felt heavy. When word spread that Alexander's generals were dividing the empire, Babylon found itself at the center of another storm. Armies passed through like ghosts, leaving dust and debt in their wake. The Seleucids took her first, making her a capital for a brief, flickering moment before abandoning her for a newer city by the Tigris. The heart of the world was being replaced one stone at a time. Babylon did not resist. She had learned that the surest way to survive conquest was to remain still. The new rulers plundered her treasures. The temples were stripped of gold to fund wars fought in faraway lands. Statues of Marduk and Ishtar were carried off to new shrines where foreign tongues stumbled over their names. The priests aged and died. Their apprentices found no one left to teach. The festivals that once filled the processional way with light were forgotten. Even the gardens, once the wonder of kings, had been left to the sun. The terraces cracked, the fountains dried, and vines turned to dust where they hung. Still, the city refused to vanish. The bricks remained warm under the relentless sun. The Euphrates continued its slow, bending course, as though reluctant to leave what it had loved for so long. Shepherds grazed their flocks among the ruins. Traders set up small markets in the shade of half-collapsed walls. Life persisted, stripped of grandeur but not of rhythm. The bones of empire had become a village. Then came the fires. Whether set by invaders or accident, no one could say. They swept through the palace quarter, consuming the cedar roofs and melting the copper doors, the air filled with the scent of resin and ash. For days, the sky above Babylon glowed red at night, a false dawn that refused to end. When it finally did, there was little left to burn. The once blue walls of the Ishtar Gate were blackened, their lions charred but still watching, eyes unblinking, patient even in ruin. When the smoke cleared, only fragments of the old splendor remained. The temples were empty shells. The ziggurat stood like a mountain of broken teeth, its summit shattered by heat. Yet amid the destruction, one small chamber survived, the scriptorium of the temple of Nabu, god of writing and wisdom. Inside, clay tablets lay scattered on the floor, baked hard by fire. The words, meant to be preserved by priests, were now sealed forever by flame. Years turned to centuries. The city shrank into itself, its outlines blurring into the plain. The descendants of its last citizens lived in mud brick houses built atop the ruins of palaces, unaware of the splendor beneath their feet. Travelers who passed through spoke of a haunted place where the wind carried voices that did not belong to the living. They said that at night the walls glowed faintly as if the city itself refused to forget its own light. To the Greeks who wrote of it, Babylon became less a place and more an allegory, a warning about pride, a tale of how even gods could grow tired of human ambition. They called her the city that reached too high. Philosophers debated whether her fall was divine punishment or natural decay. Poets turned her name into a symbol of beauty undone by hubris. Babylon for the first time ceased to be a reality and became a story. And yet within that story, she lived more fiercely than ever. Across lands and languages, her name carried the taste of both reverence and ruin. The Romans spoke of her as the mother of cities. The Hebrews called her the harlot of nations. To each she was a mirror, reflecting whatever truth humanity needed to see. Her towers might have fallen, but her image stood taller than before, rising in words instead of bricks, in prophecy instead of stone. By the time the desert winds reclaimed her streets, Babylon had become eternal in the only way that mattered, as memory. The gates no longer opened to kings but to dreamers. Scholars centuries apart would still argue over the meaning of her name. Babel, the gate of the gods, or Balalu, the place of confusion. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it had always been both. When travelers camped among her ruins, they said the nights were never entirely silent. Sometimes the wind would pass through the hollow walls and hum like distant music. Sometimes the sand would shift, revealing a brick stamped with the name of Nebuchadnezzar, gleaming faintly beneath the moon. And sometimes, when the stars were bright and the river glimmered like mercury, it seemed as though the city breathed again. Not in defiance, but in remembrance. Did Babylon die when her towers fell? Or did she simply move into the realm of myth, where nothing truly ends? Did her ghosts linger among the ruins, or were they carried away in the words that still bear her name? And if her fall was a tragedy, could it also have been her rebirth? The moment she ceased to be a city and became a story that the world could never forget. Long after the last fires had gone out, the land around Babylon began to change. The river that had once embraced the city grew restless, shifting its course little by little each year, as though retreating from a memory it could not bear. The canals dried, their beds turning to cracked mosaics of clay. Fields that had once yielded barley and dates became stretches of thorn and dust. The desert was reclaiming what it had always considered its own. The people who still lived among the ruins did not fight the change. They simply adapted, turning palaces into barns, temples into dwellings, and the courtyards of kings into places where goats slept beneath the moon. Time for Babylon no longer flowed forward. It folded inward like the layers of earth beneath her foundations. The city was no longer an empire or a temple. It was a whisper, a condition of the soul. Travelers still came, but not for conquest or trade. They came to see the bones of a legend. They came because the name itself had begun to shimmer like a mirage on the tongue. Babylon, and the word carried both beauty and warning, both pride and sorrow. Those who arrived expecting splendor found silence instead, and in that silence, something greater than gold. Among the ruins, shepherds tended their flocks. They told their children stories passed down through generations, of the hanging gardens that reached the sky, of the hand that wrote fire upon a wall, of a king who dreamed of eternity and lost himself in the mirror of his own making. The children listened wide-eyed, not knowing where history ended and imagination began. The line had long since blurred. Babylon's truth now lived in its myth, and myth, being immortal, refused to fade. Then came the Seleucids, heirs of Alexander's broken dream. They looked upon Babylon's decay and saw an opportunity. They ordered the temples rebuilt, but not for worship, for politics. They revived the festivals, but the songs were sung in foreign tongues. The old gods returned in form, but not in spirit, their statues repainted by men who did not know their prayers. For a brief moment the city seemed to stir, as though testing whether it could still remember how to live. But revival, when born of imitation, is only another kind of death. The Seleucids soon abandoned her for a new capital, Seleucia, built along the Tigris, a younger twin to an aging ghost. From that moment on, Babylon began her long descent into sleep. The temples collapsed one by one. The ziggurat eroded until its tears could no longer be counted. The Euphrates, tired of circling her carcass, wandered away entirely, leaving behind a maze of stagnant pools where reeds grew tall and snakes glided in the shallows. The wind became the city's only citizen. It moved through the streets like a memory looking for its own source, stirring the dust that once bore the footsteps of kings. Yet even in ruin, Babylon possessed a strange serenity. Travelers from the West wrote of it with awe, describing the way the sunlight struck the remaining walls, how the air seemed to shimmer with the echo of greatness. One Greek merchant recorded that he felt as though he had entered the shadow of heaven, a place too vast for the living but too beautiful for the dead. He camped beside the old Ishtar gate and dreamed of lions walking silently through corridors of blue fire. When he awoke, the dream was gone, but the scent of myrrh lingered on the wind. Centuries blurred. The Parthians ruled for a time, then the Romans, then others whose names would also fade. Each left a mark, a layer, a footprint that sank into the same dust. Babylon, meanwhile, became a place of silence, a library of echoes. Its stones, baked by sun and storm, began to fracture. Whole walls collapsed overnight, burying corridors that no one had walked in generations. And yet the city did not disappear completely. It endured in fragments, in bricks stamped with royal names, in bits of glazed tile, in stories retold by pilgrims who had never seen her. The more she decayed, the more she grew eternal. In time, only the locals remained, farmers, wanderers, and those who sought the protection of her quiet ruins. They called the place Babel, a softened echo of her ancient name. They said the ground was sacred, that to dig too deeply invited misfortune. Sometimes when the wind rose at dusk, they heard faint voices like distant chanting carried on the air. "It is the old gods," they said, "counting the years since we forgot them." The desert began to fold itself gently over what remained. Sand drifted into streets and filled the courtyards, softening the edges of stone. The city that had once reached the heavens now sank inch by inch into the earth. The lions on the walls vanished beneath dunes of silence. Only the tallest fragments of the ziggurat still broke the horizon, a reminder that once there had been something mighty here, something that dared to touch eternity. And yet, even as the earth swallowed her, Babylon did not resist. Perhaps she understood what men never could, that to endure forever one must first surrender. Her towers had fallen, her gods forgotten, but her essence had already escaped, carried on the breath of stories. Every empire that followed would borrow from her. Her laws, her architecture, her dreams. She had not died. She had become the pattern. When night came, the dunes glowed under the moonlight, their shapes forming the faint outlines of vanished walls. The wind whispered through the reeds by the empty riverbed, making a sound almost like weeping. Or perhaps it was laughter. Did the earth bury Babylon out of mercy or reverence? Did the sands come to erase her, or to protect her from the hands of time? And when the last stone disappears beneath the horizon, will the silence that remains still remember her name? Centuries passed, and the desert made peace with what it had claimed. The storms that once came like warnings now arrived like caretakers, smoothing what was broken, wrapping the old city in a soft shroud of sand. The Euphrates, shifting westward, no longer touched Babylon's walls. Yet each flood season it still sent a ghost of itself, a thin trickle that reached the edge of the ruins before sinking quietly into the ground, as if reluctant to forget. The river had outlived the city, but in its depths it carried the memory of her reflection. The nomads who roamed the plains no longer called her by her full name. To them she was simply Babel, the sleeping place. They camped among her mounds when the nights grew cold, their fires flickering where palace lamps had once burned. Sometimes they found bricks glazed with faint traces of blue, fragments of lions or dragons half buried in sand. They kept them as charms, believing they warded off evil. They said the air around Babel was strange, too still, too full of echo. At night the wind moved through the hollows of her walls, and those who listened swore they heard music, a slow rising hum like the breath of a sleeping god. The ruins became a boundary between worlds, not fully alive, not entirely gone. Shepherds grazed their flocks on the mounds, children chased the shadows of clouds across the sand, and travelers passing by stopped to rest, drawn by curiosity and unease. They said that at sunset the stones glowed faintly, holding the last light longer than they should, as though unwilling to surrender it. Even the animals grew quiet near the ziggurat, as if sensing they stood upon sacred ground. Then, one spring after a great rain, a section of the buried wall collapsed, revealing a chamber beneath. Inside lay the remnants of a temple long forgotten. Clay tablets were scattered across the floor, hardened by centuries of silence. The locals carried one to a scholar from the west who was traveling with the caravan. When he brushed away the dust and held it to the light, he saw the faint wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay. He could not read them, but he recognized their age. And in that moment he realized he was holding the voice of a vanished world. Word spread quickly. More scholars came, men with notebooks and instruments carrying brushes instead of swords. They set up tents along the river's edge and began to dig. The work was slow and careful, like the city itself was being persuaded to wake. Bit by bit the sand gave way. The outlines of streets emerged, the foundations of temples, the curve of the processional way. When the archaeologists uncovered the base of the Ishtar gate, their hands trembled. The blue tiles still glistened faintly beneath the dust, and the lions that adorned them looked as fierce as the day they were made. The air filled with the scent of earth that had not breathed for 2,000 years. In the evenings, the workers sat by their fires and spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb what they were awakening. They said the ground whispered at night, a low murmur that rose and fell with the wind. One of them swore he saw light flicker deep within a trench where no torch burned. "The city remembers," he said. The others laughed, but their laughter was quiet. When the first inscription of Nebuchadnezzar was unearthed, it was still legible. "I built this gate for the glory of Marduk, that all nations may marvel at Babylon." The letters, carved by hands long turned to dust, seemed fresh, untouched by time. The archaeologists copied them carefully, knowing they were reading words meant for eternity. Around the camp, the desert wind carried a strange sweetness that night, as though the city had exhaled after centuries of holding her breath. More discoveries followed: fragments of Hammurabi's code, broken statues of gods, shards of jewelry that once adorned queens. Each artifact was a heartbeat, each trench a reopened vein. The scholars took them away to distant museums where they were placed behind glass and labeled for the living to stare at. Yet even as the pieces scattered across the world, Babylon herself seemed to grow whole again in imagination. She had survived the empires that built her, the prophets that condemned her, the sands that buried her. Now she lived in every curious hand that brushed dust from a tablet, in every whisper spoken over her name. The locals watched in silence. To them, these foreigners were not discovering a lost city. They were disturbing a sleeping one. "The earth hides what it wishes to protect," an old shepherd said, "and those who dig must be ready to listen." The archaeologists smiled politely, but when the wind rose that night and their tents shivered, some found it difficult to sleep. The sound it made was almost like words. When the last trench was filled and the scholars departed, the sand began its slow return. Within weeks, the outlines they had drawn were gone again, swallowed by the same patience that had guarded them for millennia. It was as if the desert, having granted a glimpse, had decided that the moment was enough. The earth closed gently, not in anger but in discretion. Still, the story had escaped. The tablets and tiles traveled across oceans. The name Babylon began to shimmer again in books, in lectures, in dreams. The world remembered, and in remembering rebuilt her once more. Not of brick or stone, but of thought. Did the desert yield her secrets because she wished to be found, or because she wanted to remind us how easily we forget? Did the whisper that rose from her dust speak of pride or forgiveness? And when we walk among her echoes, are we unearthing her story or our own? Long after the diggers had gone and their footprints vanished under the shifting sand, Babylon returned to her stillness. The trenches filled, the mounds rose again, and the desert resumed its patient vigil. Yet the world had changed. Fragments of her walls now sat beneath the sterile light of museums in London and Berlin, where visitors stared through glass at what was once the heartbeat of empires. Children pressed their faces to the display, reading the name Babylon on neat white labels. Scholars spoke of her as a birthplace, of writing, of law, of cities, yet few remembered that she had also been a graveyard for dreams. Still, the earth kept her secret song. In the years that followed, explorers returned, guided by old maps and new desires. Some came seeking history, others came seeking meaning. They camped among the ruins with notebooks and cameras, their lamps glowing faintly in the vast dark. Each shovel of sand revealed a little more, A stair, a wall, a fragment of pottery. Small, fragile pieces of a world that had once believed itself indestructible. They measured everything, mapped every stone, and took careful notes. But the silence that surrounded them seemed to watch. When the wind rose, it erased their footprints by dawn, as if reminding them that discovery is only temporary. One evening, as the sun sank into the western dunes, a scholar from Baghdad stood beside the remnants of the ziggurat. The light was soft, red and gold, and the air shimmered with heat. He closed his notebook and simply listened. The call to prayer drifted faintly from a distant village, and for a moment it sounded like the echo of ancient hymns. He realized that the voices of Babylon had never vanished. They had only changed their language. The reverence, the rhythm, the longing to speak to something beyond oneself. All of it remained. Humanity had changed its gods, but not its hunger. The nights over Babylon were clearer than anywhere else on earth. The stars appeared endless, the same constellations that the priests had once mapped upon clay tablets. Standing there, one could almost imagine the astronomers of Marduk still at their work, their eyes reflecting the sky's cold fire. The scholar thought of those men who had looked upward and seen order in chaos, who had drawn meaning from the unending, who had given the heavens names so that they might feel less alone. "They were not wrong," he whispered. "We are still looking for the same light." In the early 20th century, archaeologists uncovered the Lion of Ishtar, its body carved from limestone, its mane weathered by time but still proud. The statue was lifted carefully, packed, and sent far from the land of its birth. In foreign halls it would stand, admired but misunderstood. Yet back in the desert, its absence left a hollow that the wind refused to fill. Locals began to leave offering where it had once stood. A handful of grain, a flower, a small prayer whispered to the night. Perhaps they did not know why, and only that something sacred had been taken and silence must be fed. Years passed, wars came and went, and the ruins slept beneath layers of dust and history. Soldiers built camps nearby, their boots echoing where kings once walked. Smoke rose from cooking fires where incense had burned. And yet, even amid noise and chaos, Babylon kept her dignity. The bricks did not crumble, they waited. The river still shimmered at sunset, catching the light of helicopters instead of torches, yet its rhythm was unchanged. The same water that had mirrored Nebuchadnezzar's towers now reflected barbed wire and tents. History, it seemed, was circular, repeating its shapes with different faces. In time, restoration began. Archaeologists and architects worked side by side, attempting to raise again what time had buried. Some said it was a revival, others called it a desecration. The old bricks were mixed with new, the outlines of temples redrawn in modern cement. The result was neither past nor present, but something in between. A replica built from longing. Visitors walked through reconstructed gates, tracing the images of dragons with their fingertips. For a moment they could almost believe the city had returned. But when night fell and the floodlights dimmed, the illusion dissolved. The real Babylon was not in walls or towers. It lived in the air, in the rhythm of the earth, in the persistence of memory that refuses to die. Even now, the desert guards her kindly. Each evening when the wind comes down from the north, it moves through the ruins like breath through sleeping lungs. The reeds whisper beside the dry riverbed, and the air hums faintly with warmth. Shepherds still pass through, their fires glowing in the distance. Sometimes they tell travelers that the city beneath their feet still dreams, that in its dreams the torches are lit again, the gardens bloom, and the gates open to the sound of drums. No one knows if they believe it, but belief, like memory, does not need proof. It only needs to be spoken. And so, Babylon endures, not in power but in presence. She is a ruin, a myth, a lesson, and a promise. The dust that covers her is the same dust that shaped us, and in her silence lies the story of every empire that thought itself eternal. Did those who came to rebuild her hope to bring her back, or to find themselves within her? Did they know that by touching her walls they were touching the mirror of their own fate? And when the wind erases their footprints again, will the city remember their names, as she remembered all the rest? Long after the archaeologists had packed their crates and the desert reclaimed their paths, Babylon remained. The earth that once trembled beneath armies now lay quiet beneath the wings of birds. The river no longer touched her walls, yet in the shimmering distance, the Euphrates still glowed like a memory half awake. The sky above her was vast and clear, the same sky that had looked down upon Nebuchadnezzar, Hammurabi, Cyrus, and Alexander. The same stars that had once been read as the handwriting of gods. Time had thinned the voices of empires, but the stars had never stopped speaking. On certain nights when the air cooled and the wind died, the villagers who lived near the ruins would look up and swear the heavens shimmered brighter above Babylon than anywhere else. They said the stars gathered here because they remembered being worshipped. They said the constellations leaned closer, as though curious about the silence that now replaced the hymns once sung in their honor. Whether superstition or truth, no one could deny that the night above Babylon felt different, denser, as if heavy with memory, if heavy with... Long ago, priests had climbed the ziggurat to read those same stars. They had given them names that survived even the collapse of language. Nabu, Ishtar, Marduk, Ninurta. Those names, like sparks from a dying fire, drifted across time and settled into the tongues of later civilizations. The Babylonians had seen in the heavens a mirror of the earth. Their descendants would see in it the infinite. Astronomy, born from worship, had become science, but the awe remained. The priests of Marduk had not died in vain. Their eyes had taught humanity to measure wonder. Now, thousands of years later, telescopes turn toward the same skies those priests once studied. In the silence of laboratories, far from the desert's heat, scientists mapped the movements of the same planets once etched into clay. They measured their orbits, their distances, their light. They did not call it divine anymore, but in the flicker of galaxies they still searched for meaning. In every calculation was an echo of Babylon, a whisper from the first minds that looked upward and dared to ask what lies beyond. It is strange how the stars remember. Their light crosses centuries, carrying with it images of things long vanished. Towers, rivers, kings. Somewhere in the quiet fabric of the universe, the glow that once reflected off the bricks of Babylon still travels, still moves outward, a faint echo of gold upon the endless night. The city's light, though unseen, is still on its journey, and in some distant age perhaps it will reach eyes that do not yet exist. and they will see in a faint pulse of ancient brightness the ghost of a city that refused to die. Sometimes travelers camp among the ruins and lie beneath that sky. They say that at midnight, when the world falls still, the stars seem to form a pattern. The faint outline of a tower reaching upward, a shape that glimmers for a breath before dissolving into darkness. The villagers call it Etemenanki's ghost, the phantom ziggurat. They say it appears to remind the world of humanity's oldest prayer, the wish to rise. Under those same stars, the ruins hum softly with warmth. The sand releases the heat of day, and the stones, though cracked, hold a faint vibration, as if the earth itself were still remembering the rhythm of its builders. In that moment, the distance between past and present disappears. The stars above, the dust below. Both are remnants of the same story, the same pulse. Once, an astronomer visiting from far away stood on the site of the old ziggurat and said quietly, "This is where the sky first learned to speak to us." He placed his telescope on the ground, looked up with naked eyes and smiled. And we have not stopped answering since. It was true. From Babylon's priests to modern scientists, from clay tablets to observatories orbiting the heavens, humanity's gaze has never turned away. The city by the river had given us the courage to ask, and the stars had given us the patience to wait for answers. When dawn comes, the constellations fade, their light swallowed by the growing glow of the sun. The desert warms, the mirages return, and the ruins once again belong to the living. Farmers lead their flocks through the dry fields, children chase one another along the ridges of fallen walls, and the day resumes its quiet routine. But the stars remain above, invisible in daylight, waiting for night to restore their voice. It is said that the stars and Babylon share the same secret. Both burn long after they seem to die. The light that reaches us is old, and yet it feels alive, a testament to endurance beyond time. Perhaps that is why we still look up, because we too are searching for a way to last beyond our own brightness. Did the priests who charted the heavens know that their legacy would outlive their gods? Did they understand that in studying the stars, they were ensuring that even when Babylon's bricks turned to dust, her gaze would remain fixed upon eternity? Or did they, like us, simply look upward because in the darkness they felt for a fleeting moment less alone? There are ruins that vanish into silence, and there are ruins that never stop speaking. Babylon belonged to the second kind. Though her walls had turned to dust, her name traveled farther than any army ever marched. It slipped into scripture, into song, into prophecy. To some she became the symbol of sin, the mother of corruption, the golden city punished for its arrogance. To others she was a mirror, reflecting humanity's oldest dream, the desire to touch the heavens and be remembered for it. Her fall was retold so many times that it ceased to be history and became something deeper. A parable written into the heart of every civilization that rose after her. The prophets who spoke of her destruction did not know they were keeping her alive. Each warning, each lament, each verse that began with "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great," only carved her name deeper into time. In condemning her, they immortalized her. The city that once dared to rival the gods became the story through which all empires measured their pride. And perhaps that was her final victory, to endure even as a warning. But beyond the fury of Scripture, there was another truth, quieter and more human. Babylon was not only the city of arrogance, she was the city of beginnings. From her clay came the first laws, the first maps of the stars, the first attempt to trap memory in writing. She was where mankind learned that to build is to hope, and to hope is to defy. Her towers may have fallen, but her ideas did not. Every city built after her carried a fragment of her soul. The shape of her streets, the curve of her arches, the rhythm of her calendars. Even when her name became a curse, her influence became a prayer. In Rome, architects raised temples with columns that echoed her ziggurats. In Constantinople, domes were built to mimic her sacred geometry. In the libraries of Alexandria and Athens, scholars still studied the calculations of Babylonian astronomers, tracing the same stars once watched by priests of Marduk. And in Jerusalem, poets and prophets spoke of her as both enemy and reflection. The city that fell so that faith could rise. Babylon was everywhere, hiding behind every vision of eternity. For millennia, her shadow stretched across the earth. Artists painted her fall in flames, preachers thundered her name from pulpits, philosophers pondered the meaning of her pride. To some she was divine justice, to others lost paradise. And through them all, she lived, not as ruin, but as symbol. The word Babylon came to mean any place where humanity reached too far, any dream too bright to last. Yet it also came to mean the opposite, the birthplace of what makes us human. Our refusal to stop reaching. Even now, her legacy is woven into the language of ambition. Every skyscraper that pierces the clouds, every city that glows through the night, every hand that sketches a design meant to outlast its maker, all of it carries the echo of Babylon. We have become her descendants not by blood but by desire. The same yearning that built her still drives us. The wish to create something greater than ourselves. And in that sense, the fall of Babylon was not an ending at all. It was an inheritance. Historians may measure her by stone and date, by the span of her walls or the reign of her kings. But her true dimensions are metaphysical. She exists wherever the line between aspiration and arrogance blurs. She exists in every question we ask of the sky, every law we carve to make sense of chaos, every poem that tries to defy forgetting. Her fall taught us humility, but her rise taught us wonder. And humanity cannot live without either. There is a strange mercy in that balance. Perhaps that is why the prophets in their visions of the end of days could not resist mentioning her once more. They saw her not as a ruin, but as an eternal lesson. That no tower, however high, can stand forever, and yet no fall can erase what the building itself taught the world. Babylon, the punished city, became the eternal teacher. When travelers stand among her ruins today, they often speak of feeling watched. The air seems heavy with presence, as if the past itself were aware of being remembered. The wind carries whispers through the broken bricks, not of curses, but of patience. I am still here, it seems to say. I have become the story that you keep retelling, and perhaps that is the secret all empires eventually learn. That destruction is not the opposite of creation, but its shadow. Every fall carves a shape for rebirth to fill. Babylon's towers did not crumble in vain. They became the dust from which all later visions of civilization would rise. Did the prophets ever imagine that the city they cursed would become immortal through their words? Did they know that every time humanity rebuilds, it does so under the same stars that once shone over Babylon, still daring, still dreaming, still reaching for a sky that never truly answers but always invites? The centuries folded over Babylon like layers of parchment, each one written in wind and forgetting. The Persians had vanished, the Greeks had scattered, the Parthians had burned their brief light and gone. Empires rose and fell upon the same ground, their cities blooming and fading like mirages along the rivers. Yet beneath them all, Babylon slept. The mounds of her ruins were covered in grass and dust, her walls reduced to gentle hills. Shepherds walked across them unaware that each step pressed against the bones of the world's first metropolis. The city was gone, yet its ghost persisted, not in sight but in the stories that wandered farther than her armies ever had. For centuries no one could say exactly where she lay. The landscape had changed, the river had shifted, and maps turned into myths. Travelers searched the plains guided by rumor and scripture, each claiming to have seen her shadow on the horizon. Some found nothing but sand, others found fragments, a carved brick, a column half buried, a tile the color of faded lapis. It was as if Babylon did not want to be found, as if she had chosen to sink into the earth and wait. Then, in the age of rediscovery, when the world began to look backward for its origins, men came again to the land between the rivers. They came with maps, compasses, and a new kind of devotion, not to gods, but to knowledge. When the first shovels broke the crust of the plain, the air that rose smelled of ancient smoke and salt. And then, for the first time in 2,000 years, sunlight touched the bricks of Babylon. They uncovered her slowly, reverently, as if unwrapping a relic. The processional way reappeared, still paved with the stones that once bore the feet of kings. The walls emerged, lined with lions and dragons molded in relief, their colors dulled but still defiant. When the first glimmer of blue tile was revealed, the archaeologists fell silent. Before them lay the gate of Ishtar, not legend but truth. The lions that guarded its surface stared out with eyes that seemed alive even in ruin. The city that had been blamed for humanity's pride was suddenly human again. In museums across the world, the pieces of her were gathered and reassembled. The gates were reconstructed in faraway halls, their fragments transported across oceans and continents. Visitors stood beneath them in awe, their voices hushed by the sense of standing before something older than memory itself. Yet the gate, in its new home of polished marble and glass, seemed both proud and sorrowful, a part of Babylon but no longer her heart. For the true city still lay beneath the desert, dreaming beneath layers of dust and silence. Meanwhile, scholars pieced together her words. The cuneiform tablets rescued from rubble began to speak again. Line by line they told of laws and harvests, of hymns to forgotten gods, of the courses of planets and the price of grain. Each symbol was a heartbeat, each translation a resurrection. The scribes of 4 millennia ago had written for eternity. And eternity, it seemed, had finally answered. Among the tablets was one that bore the story of a flood that had covered the world, sparing only one man who carried wisdom upon an ark. It predated every known scripture, yet its rhythm felt familiar. The past, it turned out, had been whispering to itself all along. From Babylon's clay came not just myth, but the architecture of all later faiths. She had become the foundation of the world's memory, the starting point of every story we tell to make sense of our own impermanence. And so the archaeologists wrote her name again in modern tongues, as if reintroducing an ancestor long lost. But even as they mapped her streets and catalogued her relics, they could not define her spirit. Babylon was more than the sum of her ruins. She was the first question humanity ever asked: can we make something that lasts? In her fall, she had already answered. What endures is not the walls, but the will behind them. The gates may crumble, the temples may vanish, but the longing to build, to understand, to reach, remains. That is her true legacy, scattered not in bricks, but in hearts. At night, when the desert wind moves softly over the mounds where she sleeps, the air still carries the scent of clay and rain. The stars above shimmer with the same light that once guided her priests. And those who stand there in the silence between sky and sand feel it. The pulse of something vast, neither past nor present, beating just beneath the earth. Babylon is not gone. She has simply changed her form. She lives in the languages that sprang from her, in the laws that shape our world, in the stories we tell to explain our hunger for meaning. She is in every city that rises and every ruin that follows. She is in us. Did the men who dug her from the dust realize what they had awakened? Not a ruin, but a mirror? Did they understand that in brushing the dirt from her stones, they were uncovering their own reflection? The same ambition, the same frailty, the same unending desire to turn dust into eternity? Even after the last archaeologist left and the wind reclaimed the trenches, Babylon did not vanish. She had survived too many centuries to disappear now. The earth closed gently over the unearthed walls, smoothing them as if to say that her secrets had been shared just enough. What remained was silence, not emptiness, but a presence so deep it felt alive. Beneath the desert skin, the old bricks still pressed against one another, warm with the memory of hands that shaped them. The wind moved through the reeds by the dry riverbed, carrying whispers that no one could quite translate. Some said it was the sound of ghosts. Others said it was simply the world remembering how to breathe. At night, when the moon rose, the sand turned silver, the ruins gleamed faintly. The outlines of walls appeared for a moment like a mirage of what once was. The faint echo of towers, gates, and gardens shimmering in the pale light. Those who camped nearby often woke with the feeling that they had been watched, not with malice but with curiosity, as if the city itself still listened, still dreamed. They spoke of hearing faint music, a rhythm too slow for the living, perhaps the heartbeat of time itself. The villagers who lived near the site learned to live with the silence as one lives with the tide. They carried on with their small lives, planting, herding, repairing. Yet they treated the ground with a certain reverence. They said the land beneath their feet was holy because it remembered everything. The children played among the mounds and found fragments of ancient pottery, glazed blue like the sky. Their elders told them not to take too many home. Babylon keeps count, they said, half in warning, half in wonder. Seasons passed and rain returned in brief silver curtains that fell upon the ruins. The water pooled in the depressions where courtyards once stood, turning them into mirrors. For a moment it seemed as if the city had come back. Her towers reflected upon the surface of the rainwater, her gates outlined in ripples. When the clouds broke and the sun reappeared, the illusion vanished, but the reflection remained in the mind. Babylon, it seemed, had found a way to exist between presence and absence, between myth and memory. And in the evenings, the wind would rise and sweep across the plain, carrying dust from the ruins out into the world. It drifted far beyond the Euphrates, over fields, across borders, into modern cities. No one noticed it settling on their skin, on their windows, on their books. Yet in that dust traveled the trace of history's oldest dream. The dream that mankind could build something everlasting. Perhaps every civilization since has inhaled a little of Babylon without knowing it. Perhaps that is why every generation builds its own towers, reaches for its own heavens, and inevitably watches them fall. But not all endings are loss. The story of Babylon became the story of us, of creation, of longing, of the fragile balance between faith and pride. Her rise taught us how to imagine. Her fall taught us how to remember. Every law carved, every city planned, every library built carries her reflection. Even the act of telling her story is part of her design, a continuation of the very dream that began on the banks of the Euphrates. For in the end, Babylon's greatest creation was not her walls, nor her gardens, nor her gods. It was the idea that nothing truly ends, that every ruin is only waiting to become a beginning. The night sky above her has not changed. The constellations still drift in their ancient paths, the same ones that her priests once mapped into tablets of clay. Sometimes the stars seem to burn a little brighter above her ruins, as if in recognition. The light that touched her towers thousands of years ago still travels outward, crossing the black gulf of the universe. Somewhere beyond our reach it continues to shine. The ghost light of a city that dared to rival eternity. Now and then, travelers stop by the site and stand quietly, not to worship or to study, but simply to feel the weight of time pressing gently against the air. They do not hear trumpets or voices, only the soft whisper of the wind moving through the grass. Yet in that whisper is everything. The murmur of the river, the laughter of builders, the prayers of kings, the hush of the last scribe writing his final line. Babylon is no longer a place. She is a rhythm, a pulse that passes from dust to dream to dust again. And when the night deepens and the stars seem to lean low over the plain, it almost feels as if the city stirs beneath the earth, breathing once more. The air hums, the sand shifts, and the silence becomes a song too old to name. So perhaps the question has always been wrong. Perhaps Babylon did not fall. Perhaps she simply changed form. From stone to story, from empire to echo, from city to soul. And if her fall was the beginning of us, then maybe even now, in every dream we build from the dust, Babylon is still rising. What if Babylon's fall was humanity's rebirth? If you have followed her story through the rivers of time, through dust and fire and silence, then perhaps you already know the answer. The city that once reached for heaven did not vanish. She transformed. Every wall that crumbled became a thought. Every prayer that faded became a question. Every dream of eternity became the quiet persistence that still moves through us now. Babylon was never about one kingdom or one god or one man's ambition. She was the first reflection of what it means to be human, to build, to lose, to remember, and to build again. Her ruins taught us that no creation is wasted. Even the fallen towers left shadows that became our blueprints. Her laws shaped the language of justice. Her astronomers taught the stars how to speak to us. In her collapse, the seed of humility took root. And from that humility came the patience to understand time. Every civilization since has carried her dust in its veins. Rome, Constantinople, Baghdad, New York. Each city has been another Babylon rising from the same longing to outlast the night. We rise, we fall, and in the falling we remember why we began. The story of Babylon is not a warning against pride alone. It is a reminder of balance, that creation and destruction are twin movements in the same breath. The hand that builds the tower is the same that writes upon the wall. The river that nourishes also floods. The fire that purifies also consumes. Babylon fell not because she reached too high, but because she forgot to listen to the silence that waits at the top of every tower. The gods she defied were only reflections of her own heart, and when they turned away, it was only to let her see herself more clearly. And so we continue her work. Every time we draw a map, trace a constellation, write a law, or tell a story about who we were, we are still walking her streets. We are still pressing our stylus into clay, carving our hope into the bones of the world. Babylon's true legacy is not pride, but memory. The will to endure through remembrance. The first city taught us that immortality is not the absence of ruin. It is the persistence of meaning through ruin. If you stand today among her remains, the wind will speak softly through the broken stones. It does not mourn. It recites. It tells of builders who sang to the rhythm of their own heartbeat, of kings who thought they could command time, of queens who dreamed of gardens in the sky. It whispers of the last scribe who buried his words beneath the dust, so that one day we might find them again and understand. Babylon breathes through every age that remembers her. And in that remembrance, she lives. Perhaps that is why her story feels so close. Because it is not only hers, it is ours. Each of us carries a small echo of Babylon, the part of the soul that dares to create something that will last. The quiet fear that it will not, and the faith to begin again anyway. And maybe that is what rebirth truly means. Not perfection, not permanence, but the courage to rise after every fall. The river keeps flowing. The dust keeps settling. The stars keep watching. And we, fragile, stubborn, luminous, keep building toward the light. So when the night grows long and the world feels like ruin, remember the city that refused to disappear. Remember the towers that turned to stars, the laws that turned to language, the silence that turned to song. Babylon fell, but her heartbeat became the rhythm of civilization itself. She is the breath in every story, the spark in every creation, the stillness beneath every empire's roar. And as long as we dream, as long as we reach, as long as we remember, Babylon will rise again. Thank you for walking through her ruins with us, for listening to the wind where the past still whispers. If this journey has stirred something within you, let it continue beyond this night. Share her story, speak her name, carry her light, until the next tale unfolds. May the stars above Babylon guide your dreams, and may you never forget how to build from dust. This is Cryptic Realm Channel, where the past never truly sleeps.